I'm delighted to have on the show today Kaspar. We were just talking in the green room a little bit about some checkered backgrounds and where we all started. Kaspar, so good to have you on as a guest today.
Jim, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Kaspar and I both spoke at the Elevate Summit in the summer, I think it was, probably a few months ago. And
September.
and I watched you present. You did a fantastic job, and I was hoping to grab you afterwards to have a chat, and you'd gone. I just think you're way too busy, always too busy.
I suppose I'm one of many in this industry. You know how it goes. Such an exciting time to be in our biz because there is so much going on. And obviously, there is such a huge demand for the expertise that we bring to the table. It's a beautiful time to be essentially an SEO consultant and to work in our business.
Yeah. How did you find the Elevate Summit? We have a new event that starts. As always, the first one's the most difficult for the organizers. I thought they did a phenomenal job. I just was interested to know what you thought.
Well, I suppose Leanne is such an experienced organizer. I worked together with her and her team time and time again, so I was not surprised at all that it worked out perfectly. Everything was really perfect. It's not just about London, right? London being a very good spot for being in the online marketing biz, but it's also the speaker selection, the topic selection. It's the whole thing. It's the whole package. I'm not surprised at all that it worked well. It was obviously a huge pleasure. The only thing I was a little bit saddened about is that we didn't manage really to talk and really beyond a quick exchange while I was on stage. And I'm very glad that we have this opportunity to catch up today.
Yeah, but for the benefits of people listening, Kaspar reached out to me and said that he'd listened to some other episodes. I always think if you're doing something like a podcast, that's the best testimony you can get, right? That somebody wants to be a guest, having listened to other episodes of the podcast. So, Kaspar, I've known you for a number of years. I know you and your partner, Philly, for ages. Funny enough, I always remember Philly and I used to be like much bigger than we are now, right? So funny enough, he was one of my inspirations. I met him at, I think it was at Brighton SEO. He was presenting and I thought, looks like Philly, but a lot thinner than the one that I was used to knowing, right? And and obviously he'd lost a ton of weight. He was always my kind of favorite person at Brighton SEO because he said he didn't drink. So he used to give me his excess drink coupons to get drinks at the bar. So it was always good to have because have him there as a kind of contact. So you guys, you're the Search Brothers now, but historically, like, started working with Google back in the, right? So back in the day when sort of web spam was rife and rampant. Tell us a little bit about that experience. How did you get the jobs at Google?
All right. That was an interesting story indeed. I wasn't really very much connected to the online marketing world at the time. I had some relevant transferable experience working for major companies. But at some point, it was really the classic. I saw an ad and it's very, very cryptic. It did say Google. It did say it's going to be European headquarters in Dublin, but it said precious little about the actual task at hand. Kind of between the lines said, you'll be working for an elite task force. I did apply, and this process was pretty straightforward. There are just a handful of interviews, 4 interviews to the best of my recollection. And I think the whole process took maybe a month or 6 weeks altogether. So essentially at the beginning of 2006, I did join that search team at the time, search quality team at the time, as it was called. And one of the first people who were already on that team was, I believe, a couple who joined a couple of weeks or a couple ahead of me was Felix. This very successful relationship that we continue having up until today. That started really early in 2006. We worked on a number of projects within Google. We did work together on outreach, which was hugely gratifying. It was an opportunity really to reach out to the industry out there, to reach out to the community, to give back, to share, especially in other languages, not just English. Back in the day, Google did not communicate with the webmaster community in other languages all that much. And it was a great ride. And at some point, Philly broached the idea, look, we're really good in what we're doing together. There is obviously a demand. I've been thinking about change. I've been thinking about building a brand. How about we do it together? And that was the beginning of Search Brother. It was a fantastic ride ever since. I'm profoundly grateful for this opportunity, for the opportunity to have not only just worked at the major search engine, the major search engines, but also for all the people that we met at the time, including Philly. And these are relationships that, of course, you maintain those relationships. We thrive on these relationships and we very much enjoy that exchange. that is happening up until today.
So how long did you actually work at Google for?
That was 7 years.
Okay. So I'm trying to think when Google IPO'd, I guess you were just post IPO where you're.
Sadly, one might say, because it is much preferable to be hired pre-IPO. I was unfortunately hired post-IPO. Don't get me wrong, I did get a very reasonable deal at this time. But of course, for anyone out there trying to get their foot in the door with the new Google, I took it there pre-IPO is much better for your financial situation.
Of course, yeah. I know quite a lot of my old industry friends are pre-IPO Googlers. And in some respects, I always said the pre-IPO Googlers were different than the post, right? That doesn't mean they're any better. It's just they were different because their motivation for sticking around was different than maybe people that are coming in now. And obviously Google has evolved into being one of the biggest companies in the world by far. And clearly they've had their challenges and everything else. So I guess with the Search Brothers setting up in 2013, you've seen a lot since then.
We have, it's a different perspective. It's a different vantage point. Previously, our focus really was on providing the best possible user experience for any given query. Uh, Now, ever since setting up our own operation and building our own brand, the focus lies, of course, on clients, on our customers. We want to make sure that they get the competitive advantage that they're essentially paying for. We're working together, and that's of course something that is much more narrowly focused on the signals of just one web platform, a multitude of web platforms, rather than the entire index. It's different. The signals are quite comparable in that sense. The learnings from Google are phenomenal. This is something that gives us really an edge, something we pass on to our clients, something that we enjoy doing. And whenever we work with clients, of course, the most enjoyable thing is when clients return something we work really, really hard. It's not just about client loyalty, but it is, of course, about continuous relationships that we maintain and we treasure over the years.
Yeah, because I remember back in the day, I was working for a travel company and we were very unlucky. I say unlucky, we probably weren't unlucky at all to suffer a manual penalty. We got booted out of the Google index in Australia. And I always remember having a conversation with the guy who was head of SEO at the time. And I think I'd spoken to Philly and said, look, can you guys help us? You said, yes. You said, how much? You told us a price. I said to the head of SEO, this is how much it's going to cost. He goes, oh, that's really expensive. Right. And I'm like, compared to what? Compared to not being in the index? Because we were losing probably thousands of dollars every hour almost. Right. And it's sort of,
Right.
when you look at it in that context, having the knowledge of understanding kind of what's caused the problem and what needs to be done to rectify the problem is, to me, it's almost like invaluable, right? Priceless in some respects, right? And we were able to get back in the index so quickly compared to what would probably have had to happen had we not had the opportunity to talk to you guys.
I'm glad you're mentioning that, because this is one of those instances where it's not just a Google search experience. Both me and Philly worked for a subsection of that team at the time. That team was specifically tasked with not just applying, manual actions, but also removing those wherever that was warranted. And that, of course, gives us the insider knowledge that was really helpful in successfully applying for reconsideration whenever there is a manual penalty in place, aka a Google penalty. As you're absolutely right, price is always a factor, right? Money is a resource, as is time, as is revenue. And whenever we have a similar conversation along the line, how do you arrive at this particular price? Now, there is data that needs to be crawled. And in the case of penalties that relate to content, you have to crawl a significant portion of the website to understand what Google disapproves about. In terms of backlinks, whenever there's a manual spam action that pertains to link building that Google disagrees with, you have to crawl that backlink profile. You have to evaluate it. So there's always data involved. So these prices, they aren't really coming into existence from thin air. They are data driven. SEO, as both me and we know, it's a data driven business. Of course, expertise is important. Having worked with similar, that's very, very helpful. That's very useful. But ultimately, you do need the data in order to be able to make an ultimate pronouncement, in order to provide actionable advice to a client. So this is where the pricing is coming from. And you did mention travel, the travel vertical, which is one of my favorites, not just because I used to be a very frequent
It
traveler
was one of my favorites
at the
until
time.
COVID, and then not so much, right? So
You may be surprised. I mean, COVID was really a bummer for a lot of those businesses that were in the travel industry, and some of those took it as an opportunity because it was at some point it was obvious. All right, it's pandemic. It's going to be endemic at some point. We will return back to travel, and at that point there will be so much hand up need for travel. People have not been traveling for a really long period of time, so there's going to be a lot of revenue to be generated if you're on top of the game. So what did some of the businesses do? Some people did scale down, and other people decided this is a very good time to review our systems, to take a critical look and introduce all the changes we would never dare to introduce because we know it's going to cost us not just money, but also time, and it's going to create fluctuations, right? If I change the URL structure on the website that is 100 million landing pages plus, that's going to create some fluctuations, right? That's effectively a migration. So I rather do that during a lull time. And the pandemic obviously was a prolonged period where there wasn't much travel going on. And most of those sites that did use that time wisely, they didn't bounce. They regained visibility. They got their market share increased. It was really an opportunity in disguise.
yeah, I think I always work primarily now with e-commerce businesses, and again, a lot of the work we do is in paid advertising. And what's always interesting to me is how many brands want to start tinkering with their website in the most mission critical times of year, right? So not, we've not long had Black Friday, Cyber Monday. A lot of them are kind of like right up until the last minute, Christmas shopping, trying to get stuff in before Christmas. And they're like, let's change stuff on the website. Let's do this, let's do that. I always used to say, we need to have an amnesty. Like I'd probably say, let's, beginning of November, don't do any code changes at all. Don't mess around with anything. Don't make the kind of code base unstable in any way. You need to make sure that everything is locked and loaded, and leave it. And just, if you need to make changes, you'll make those changes in the off period. So in the same way that you said about travel with the pandemic, yeah, planes weren't taking off, but people were still going to be looking for things at some point in time. There'd still be a need for people to satisfy the, I'm getting stir crazy at home. Where can I go when this all finishes? So they would still be researching things.
Yeah. And it's spot on, exactly as you're saying, but it's very individual, right? So for the retail business, and as you will very well know, Q4, that's money quarter, right? There are, however, businesses as in auctioning platforms. Q4 is very important, but Q1 may be more important yet, because there is so many undesirable, unwanted gifts that people need to find a new owner for that gift. So it's being resold, whatever really wasn't a great match. So it really depends on the vertical. It really depends on the industry. Completely different, of course, for the travel business, depending on the region that we're aiming for. There are better and worse times to conduct an audit. There is, however, always the best time to start collecting server logs. And the reason for me mentioning that is because for all those large websites, be that retail or travel, crawl budget management is critical, right? And it's possible to manage crawl budget much better with server logs as in comparison than without, because only server logs allow us really a profound insight into what Google prioritizes, what Google thinks are the most important landing pages of any given web platform, any given website. For that reason, the right time to start saving and preserving server logs is right here and now. It's instantly. For any listener out there who they're not quite sure, or maybe they do record server logs and overwrite them after a period of 4 weeks or half a year, or maybe it's not being collected completely, whatever happening in between. Make sure that you continuously save and preserve your server logs, and in perpetuity. You will be very happy to have these. There is, of course, the SEO perspective, where you can utilize those server logs in the future to come to much better optimize your website. But there is also the other aspect, which you can use as leverage in order to get that decision approved, which is, let's use those server log, that server log data, once it's accumulated, as leverage if there is an exit situation where the company is being sold. Because the pricing is very much different if there is data associated with any business where you can prove This is what's been happening over the years. This is the projections. So server loads can be utilized in many ways. For SEO purposes, it's absolute gold.
Yeah, I always think with people always say this has happened unexpectedly. And I think certainly in our sphere, nothing happens unexpectedly. Generally speaking, if you're subject to a manual penalty, it's either you've done something wrong or something that you have done maybe historically has all of a sudden become like dangerous and toxic. And sometimes you may not realize it at the time. And I think that's where you mentioned there about analyzing things like backlinks and things like that, right? Understanding who's sending the traffic to you and what's the sort of signals in terms of, is this dangerous, that particular site is sending it? Because I know way back in the days, in the sort of early 2000s, there was a lot of people that was quite heavily involved with black hat tactics. And some of it was obviously they were trying to gain Google, but they were also trying to gain their competitors, right? So they would be trying to send toxic links to competitors in the hope that Google might go, these links are toxic, I'm going to take your site down. And I guess that's probably, I could never understand. A lot of people say, why do disavow files exist? It's, again, I'm not associated with that at all. So you need to be able to say that's nothing to do with me whatsoever. That's completely something else. Something else has caused that. That's not me. And I need to say, I'm going to put distance between me and that.
Well, it's funny you're mentioning the disavow file because Google keeps saying for a prolonged period of time, we're likely to discontinue. It's not going to last forever. And it's still in existence. It still can be used. Now, the most recently, Google is saying you can only use the disavow file if there is a manual spam action in place, aka penalty. So you could technically only submit a disavow file to begin with if there is a manual penalty in place. That's still not the case. It's possible to submit a disavow file at any point in time. I think it's a great opportunity. And I'm speaking really, this is just my personal opinion based on what I have seen on both sides of the fence, if you want. And I think having the disavow file is a great way to disassociate the website from its legacy, because we have to keep in mind, we're talking large organizations. Now, there is a huge retention in large organizations, right? So something that was conducted and built over years, people responsible for these signals, they are not around anymore. They moved companies, they climbed up ladder and they had their careers and they moved on. They don't know. So whoever is in charge at that point in time, they can't be reasonably blamed for link builds that was done in the past or whatever else signals, might fall upon. Having the opportunity to actually proactively disassociate a website from potentially harmful signals is actually a good thing. And it ties perfectly into what I really call an aspirational SEO audit. I think some people call that a defensive SEO audit, which is essentially a cyclical one. So you have a 12-month or an 18-month cycle where an SEO audit is being conducted no matter what. There may or may not be an issue. The visibility of a website may be on a positive or on a negative trajectory. Doesn't matter. It's being conducted because we want to make sure that the infrastructure, the architecture, content signals, technical signals, that everything is coherent and consistent, and it actually allows the website to put its best foot forward for any given query in its vertical. Going about SEO in that way is certainly something that I would recommend to large companies where you really would like to have this kind of, not certainty, but a stable situation where changes, sudden drops are really undesirable, something to be prevented. So kind of like an insurance policy, something you do, something that is really quite comparable to bringing your car for a checkup just before go on a cruise. You don't want to get stuck on the highway with the kids screaming in the back, are we there yet? Well, you really can't move forward, you're stuck and you're waiting for help to come. You don't want to be in that situation. So you bring the car, you check the oil, check the fluids, check the brakes, check the lights, check the oil pressure. And the website is a vehicle. The website is a vehicle that generates revenue. It's quite comparable. I always suggest this is the most safe, most secure path forward to understand what's happening, to be fully in control rather than opposite, trusting for the best, but never knowing what's going to happen.
What are your thoughts on AI? Because again, so many people talk about AI being it's going to replace their jobs and everything else. And I know certainly on the pay side of things that a lot of people are leaning into AI heavily. I know Google on the ad side of things, leaning into AI heavily. Meta on the ad side, leaning into AI heavily. And some of the things they come up with are great, right? But some of them not so much. And I've always had that challenge of clients are telling me Google's recommending this, Meta's recommending this. And I'm like, yeah, but they're using sort of artificial intelligence, not looking at the data that we have about your specific business, right? And I think that's always the challenge is they're trying to fit a model into the whole world. And I'm trying to fit the model into just how it impacts individual clients. And I just wondered what your thoughts were in terms of AI from an SEO perspective.
I want to say, I'd like to give you a short and then maybe a little bit more elaborative answer. In my book, LLMs, I prefer to talk about LLMs because it's not sentient. It can't really tell you a good joke. It doesn't really it's not compassionate. So it's not really artificial intelligence quite yet. But large language models, yes, I concur with that. Large language models are a two-edged sword. There is tremendous potential in terms of improving and expediting some cycles. Software production cycles, there is no question that they can be utilized and they make development essentially much faster. That being said, there are people who are very much concerned about their job security, the future of their jobs being impacted by AI products out there. And I don't really share that concern because from an SEO perspective, AI is just one tool under our belt. And there's many tools out there. Just because there is one more tool, it doesn't fundamentally revolutionize the industry. AI is very useful, but it is something that returns data that is based on input. And that input is not quantified in any way. That input, there is no qualitative verification to that input. And what I mean by this is that the results that AI presents for queries, for instance, if you want to utilize a comparison with Google, at times it's really great, and at times it's patently wrong because somebody said something that is absolutely wrong, and AI services crawled that information, took it for granted, and is using that as output. So AI, in that sense, if we take a step back and look at the bigger picture, Google and AI are not so different in that sense because they are fundamentally reliant on input. And that input, if that's not great, the output is not great. Rubbish in, rubbish out.
It's funny.
Right?
Yeah, I remember that there was a story back in the day when I first started, way back, like 2000, 2001, something like that. There was a government department here in the UK called the Department for Trade and Industry, right? It's very well respected, thought of government department that was obviously trying to encourage the adoption of online activity, right? So at the time, online was really very in its early days. And I remember the person who was the head of the DTI, right, standing up in the Commons and basically talking about the kind of the state of the UK and where the kind of where the kind of the growth opportunities were in the UK. And this particular person cited that Aberdeen in Scotland was the fastest growing area for online adoption in the UK. And when you actually drilled into it a little bit more, the data behind it, what had actually happened is they were doing some sort of survey. People were filling in a form and they were asked to fill in the form. And one of the fields on the form was a drop-down box that had Aberdeen pre-selected in it. And I think a lot of people had just forgotten to go and change that to wherever they happened to be. By default, the data was wrong, not because there was nothing nefarious. It was just like it was human error that kind of caused this particular problem to happen. And I think it's probably the same thing. If you go to some websites now, I'm always amazed that they've got Afghanistan, I think, is always the first drop-down country in a drop-down list, right? You're thinking, if 90% of your sales happen in the US or the UK, wherever it might be, why have you even got a drop-down that's got Afghanistan in it, right? If you can't ship to Afghanistan, you shouldn't have it in the drop-down, right? I've never understood why developers don't take the time to actually think through these situations and what they can do to rectify it, to make us, again, ultimately it's about, I'm sure that Google's objective is to ensure that people have a good user experience, right? And by creating a good user experience, I've sit and watch family members and see the frustrations they have in trying to interact with websites on a mobile phone. And it's just horrible, right? And you're thinking, clearly these businesses have not taken the time to actually spend. They may be on a 27-inch iMac, right? And that's a very different user experience than somebody on a really old iPhone 7 or something like that. It's a completely different user experience altogether.
And at times, it's interesting you're mentioning it. At times, I do see companies trying to really promote an app. And I can't help but asking myself, why would I install yet another app? I'm just in a store. I'm trying to find a product. I may need the product number. The website is fully sufficient. I do not want to clutter up my phone, which is already heavily loaded with all the apps I'm actually needing on a daily basis, plus a couple of games for the children. I don't need yet another app. A really optimized, mobile optimized website will remain, in my book, the primary channel in the vast majority of cases. There will be exceptional brands where people are so heavily enticed to utilize that particular outlet that they may actually install an app. And in that case, it's justified. But for the vast majority of websites out there, it's not about having an app. You can have an app. This is a side project. If you want to focus your resources, you should heavily optimize your website. And if you don't want to do anything else, if you don't have the manpower or the capacity really, if you don't have the technical acumen in house, if you can't do anything much else, just make sure your website is really fast, right? And it's not about Google saying so. It's about your users, because Google re-emphasizes performance for one reason and one reason only. It's their users. Their users indicate with their behavior they much prefer a fast loading user experience as in comparison to something that loads even slightly slower. So any other factor roughly comparable, again, competitors, the faster websites, and they tend to win. And of course, SEO is a much wider field, many other factors that can be very much optimized in order to throw competition. But if you have to focus on just one signal and one signal only, focus on performance.
And it's
This is the winning. This is as close as it gets to a silver bullet.
Yeah, and I think so many like web designers and developers fancy themselves as a bit of an SEO expert, right? So they'll finish off the website and then they'll go, "I've SEO optimized the site for you," right? I've also done that, right? And when you actually drill into it, I always remember somebody who'd built a website, and I think the images of like their C-suite, right? So they had a picture of the CEO and the CFO and everything else, and the site was so slow, right? And when you actually drilled into it and looked at it, all of the images were like 10,000 pixel squares, right? So they were huge. They were probably like 80 megabytes each image on the page, right? And there was 5 of them,
High
because
resolution.
they're absolutely high resolution. And they were complaining about the fact that people weren't sticking around. Why would they stick around, right? If your page is like 500 meg, why on earth would anyone stick around to wait for all of these images to download? Especially as I know that bandwidth is a lot cheaper now, but back then it was like very expensive to download images on a mobile phone, right? It's obviously a lot better now with caching and everything else. And there's so many things that you can do to improve all of that sort of functionality, right? But yeah, I've always said that even though I predominantly do paid advertising, site speed is still important for paid advertising, right? If pages take a long time, people are just not going to stick around, and they're not going to stick around this particular time, and they're never going to come back because I had a horrible experience when I was going to that site, so I'm not going to go there again. I think that's where sites like Shopify, I think, have become so powerful now in the e-commerce space, because they made it so that they take care of a lot of the sort of the heavy lifting, the grunt work on the back end, right? So the developers and designers don't have to worry about too much, and they still need to a point, right? I'm always amazed when I go in to look at the back end, right? Because Shopify has this marketplace where all these app developers that sort of sit on the periphery of the ecosystem of the Shopify main code. They go in and they put Klaviyo in, and they put all of these apps, and they install tons of them, and then they stop using them, but don't uninstall them, right? And that code still bloats the page when it loads, because the app is technically still on the page, even though it's not an active app, right? I've always said you need to go through and clean up house from time to time, right? You may have got rid of the smell of the fish, but the damage could still be there.
Legacy. See, legacy signal. It's a very big part of the consideration, and particularly of the defensive or aspirational audit we talked about earlier. But you actually touched on a very important point previously when you started talking, and when you there are different stakeholders in any organization, and even in very compact, agile businesses where there's only a handful of people contributing to the online presence. There would be someone dealing with the front end. There would be a developer dealing with the back end. There is a person that creates the content, right? So there might be a marketing person that does the PR releases or the collaboration with a third party that does maybe some link building. Now, all of these people combined, they do contribute in one way or the other to SEO signals that are relevant to Google. Now, these SEO signals, they also interact with each other. We may have a situation where there is a lot of linking pointing to a particular part of the website, but that particular part of the website is not so important. So if it's ranking really well, that's not necessarily the most desirable output. Or maybe it has been moved, but it's not probably 301 redirected. There's a million different scenarios. Bottom line being here, it's a team sport. I'm myself a Formula One fan. I like to compare SEO really to that kind of sport, to a team sport where you would have a number of people contributing in their own capacity. You have the technicians, you would have the physicians, the pilot, the people that do the strategy, but there is only one team principal, and that's one person that is the head of SEO, if you want. And the title obviously doesn't matter, be that a marketing director or e-commerce director or head of SEO, be that as it may. That one person that mitigates those styles between that large group of people. And when we start talking about larger organizations that operate in a multitude of languages, obviously that groups get so much larger. And in that instance, corporate culture is key, because what we see time and time again is that corporate culture very much contribute towards SEO becoming better and better over time, transparency being a particularly important factor here. And it's something that can be standing in the way. In particular, when where everybody essentially does everything for themselves, or where there is like language barrier, or one language team would operate individually, another one would do whatever they think is best, and they don't really talk to each other. That naturally leads to situations where signals are inconclusive, confusing, and that's really, really bad, because in that instance, obviously we allow bots, including Googlebot and BingBot, to crawl, and the algorithms to pick and choose whatever appears to be the most desirable landing page. And that may or may not what we actually want to be ranking down the line. So there are factors that transcend to SEO that one wouldn't associate necessarily with SEO to begin with, including corporate culture.
Yeah, I think the biggest headache I see is the whole silo mentality that enterprises have, right? Everyone's working in teams, right? So you've got the SEO team, the email team, the web design team, the developers, right? The C-suite, the kind of the people that make the money, a social, organic social. There's so many different people all trying to input into how they think things should be done, right? And primarily what they're trying to do is they're trying to influence the decisions to make their results look the best, right? And that can be sometimes done at the detriment of others. I've always maintained that if you're an enterprise business, you should have dedicated PPC landing pages that are no index, no follow, that you strip away all of the stuff that's really important for SEO purposes, but not particularly helpful for PPC purposes, right? Because then that way you're segmenting and isolating the experience that the people that are coming through paid search are getting, because you're in more control. When you do SEO, you're very much at the kind of, to an extent, you're at the hands of Google's mercy in terms of what, as you say, which sites, which pages they think are better for a particular outcome, search and query or whatever it might be. Whereas on the paid search side of things, you used to have more control. So you could say, this is the keyword, this is the landing page, and you can sculpt that page accordingly, right? They're moving away from that now to broad match and AI, and will control the kind of, will decide what we think is best. And I think that's the biggest challenge that I think paid practitioners are having, is how do you actually address the fact that Google they are clearly in a good position to make those decisions because they have data that we don't have access to, right? So they know everything that's happened before, somebody gets to the point where they click through to your link, right? And if somebody's done 25 searches of other search terms before they get to you, you may go, that search term isn't relevant, but Google's got all of that data of what happened beforehand to decide that this is going to be a good experience as sending them to this particular page for that particular query. And that's always been the challenge, because I think probably SEO people are less like it, but paid people are much more like control freaks. They've been freaking out about the loss of data, and they don't have keyword data anymore. And I just think you just have to get on with it. It's just, that's the way of the world.
Unfortunately, yes. And I think we all very, very keen on getting as much data as possible in our hands, relevant data, contextual data. I want to have her pick up on something that you mentioned earlier, that siloing that you mentioned. That's really rather problematic, right? There is also another aspect that really standing in the way, which is the kind of thinking that focuses entirely on quarterly results. As in, you may have a conversation with a prospective business partner who says, perfectly fine, you have all the budget in the world, go ahead, do your thing, and we anticipate the results. We expect the results to be ready and come to fruition and work perfectly within 3 months. And that is something that one can reasonably expect and can bring that to the table. However, we have to keep in mind that crawl budget for large websites, just to revert to that topic for a moment again, is a real factor, because if a website is being crawled, let's say, I'm going to just throw out a number, 10 million landing pages per month. And by the way, Google is crawling less and less because they're trying to cut cost and reduce duplication. Let's say for a moment, just for the conversations, that any given website is being crawled 10 million landing pages per page, which would be actually quite a significant number. And now that includes recrawling the root time and time again, and recrawling the most important categories, and probably some product pages time and time again. So there's some duplication. We would need a month to recrawl the entire website for Google to notice that there is improved signals, new content, and so forth. Now, let's compare that number against the actual size of the website. If the website is anywhere between, let's say, 5 to 10 million landing pages in total, that's fine. I just need a month. What about if the website is 100 million landing pages? Now we need at least 10 months, right? Now, what if the website is much larger than that? And the only way to go about it is, of course, to look into it, try to manage that crawl budget, try to make sure that Google focuses and prioritizes what the client, the website operator, the publisher really want. But at the same time, it's really nothing else than wishful thinking to say, we want to have the results in 3 months. That's simply not going to happen if we have a tenfold situation between the volume of landing pages that can and are being crawled in a month and the volume of landing pages that must be crawled in order for Google to understand the website has changed. What I'm trying to say here is that SEO is complex, and us as an industry, an awful lot of time, we must ensure that there is a broader understanding for how it works and how much of a team sport it is, and that there are factors that are quite outside the realm of our control. That, of course, includes Google Update, of which there are a multitude every day. And I always tell business partners, or in conversations at conferences, please don't focus on these all too much, because you can spend your whole day focusing on current and upcoming updates. But that's not going to move your business forward. That's not going to help you to get ahead of the competition, if you want.
Yeah.
And there's other factors as well. There's also what the competitors do. So let's focus on the one thing that we actually can change and improve, which is one's own website.
Yeah. I've always maintained that the only thing that we can absolutely guarantee that is going to happen is that things are going to change. As you say, like updates happen all the time. And what may have worked today may stop working tomorrow. What may work 6 months ago may come into kind of vogue again and be active again for a period of time. But again, it comes back to what is good for the end user. That I've always maintained. Although I work with clients, I'm really more focused on the end user experience. If they have a good experience, they will come back over and over again to the site. They'll bookmark it. They'll tell their friends and all that sort of stuff, all those signals that this has been a good experience for them, right? Similarly, if they have a bad experience, they won't come back, right? And I think to your point about the crawl budgets, right? If you have 1 million pages that never, ever change, why on earth would Google continue to keep coming back time and time again to crawl a page that they go, the last 50 times I came to this page, nothing had changed. So they won't come to it again. So even though you might make a change, you might say, I made a change. Why haven't they picked it up? It's because the previous 50 times, nothing was different. You need to try and, again, it's almost like lay the breadcrumbs to say, this is what I want you to do. You want to try and influence the kind of crawling decisions based upon the data that you have and everything else. So
Yeah, and I think it's also very important to continuously remind oneself, just as you said, the flux, the change is the only thing that is a constant. There will be change no matter what, and there is no guarantees, including that the traffic that is forthcoming from search engines is not guaranteed. For that reason, I'm always appreciative of Bing traffic. And the reason for me saying that is because it allows us to have, other than direct type in traffic, loyal users that are already familiar with the brand that don't need a search engine to find what they're looking for. Even though their market share is relatively small in many European countries, I think Bing can provide the lifeline for the day that something goes terribly wrong with Google rankings. And it can be completely unintentional. The classic thing is there is a staging server that is completely no indexed, and we happen to have a release. The no index isn't really being rectified, it's not removed, and we have a new release of the website with a no index applied across board, right? That's a very devastating scenario. Typically, the rankings tank altogether. In that situation, you want to make sure that up until Bing picks up in that signal, you have that traffic. And of course, you want to rectify it. No question about that. No, it could be a manual spam action. And these, of course, are not applied across board. Bing on set of rules. So whatever happens, if it actually does happen, you want to make sure you have as much traffic as possible that is still forthcoming just to keep your cash flow while you're mitigating, managing that worst case, that SEO horror that is unfolding. And at the same time, I think it's important to remember, because nobody really wants to be there in that situation, right? Nobody wants their rankings to tank from one day or another. And in many situations, this is really a terrifying prospect, but it can be a blessing in disguise. It's very hard to see it that day, but often it allows for that change that was long in coming and always postponed, right? And particularly for large organizations.
it forces the
Large,
decision, doesn't it? It forces them to make the decision to do it. I always remember
right,
I used to work for one of the clients I worked with was the London Tourist Board, which is now called Visit London. And I worked with them way back in the day. And I was doing all their paid search. I wasn't actually doing any SEO for them, but I knew enough about SEO to be dangerous. And I remember like they had hired this agency who was doing sort of some of their SEO. Bearing in mind, Visit London had 7 editors that would like basically writing blog posts long before blog posts was even a thing, right? They were doing editorial content. So they would have thousands of places in London that people would go to if they were visiting London as a tourist, and they would write about the experience. They would take pictures and all that sort of stuff. They were getting something like 30,000 visitors a day from Google organically from SEO.
right.
Fantastic. Then all of a sudden, one day, like they called me up and said, Jim, we don't really know what's happened. Our website traffic has gone from 30,000 visitors a day to about 1,500. And we don't really know what's happened. So the first thing I did was I looked at their robots text file. And what had happened was that this SEO agency had created 3 basically doorway pages for their site, de-indexed effectively the entire site by and were routing all of the traffic to these doorway pages. And obviously all the traffic had vanished. And I basically said, there's your problem. So I said, look, I tell you what we'll do. I said, let's make some changes to the robots text file. I said, no, tell you what, let's just delete the robots text file. Let's get rid of it altogether. Right. So we literally, we got rid of the robots text file altogether. So there wasn't one. And obviously you need one, but I figured the site would work without it. And within a day, I think the traffic went back to 30,000 visitors as it had been before, right? Sometimes, as you say, the margins are caused by individuals within an organization, right? So things like when domains lapse, right? Because the person that registered the domain doesn't work for the company anymore, right? Their email address was shut down because they wanted to save £3 or £4 a month, right? In fees to Google for a kind of Google Workspace email address without setting up a forwarding address. So there's so many things that can happen on the back end that you don't really realize until they actually happen to you as a result of it. And that's always one of the scary things when you wake up and you go, wow, what has happened? When we had that manual penalty in Australia, it was like the end of the world, right? For that particular market, because so many people worked on that market, producing content for that market. And yeah, I think that the company had gone a little bit too far with some of the things that they probably shouldn't have done, and they walked it back. I think sometimes the margins between brilliance and disaster are so fine, right? There are tiny margins between the two, right? In order to be competitive. In certain verticals, I know in adult and gaming and things like that, it's almost like you have to be thinking almost like a black hat person all the time, because without it, you're just doomed to fail.
There is certainly much difference, not just between different verticals, but also different language. You should focus on particularly on what we like to refer to as the smaller languages, or essentially markets where there is a smaller index, where there's possibly a smaller population. At times, this is even much more competitive and a much more edgy SEO, or really where there's different shades of both that are being applied. The one thing that you mentioned previously, the fact that it's time renewing a domain, something that is being omitted, and that creates a whole lot of problems, as we have both seen time and time again. On that note, there is a lot of functional domains that real brands don't really look at quite a lot, frequently up until the moment they need them. Now, a very common way of saving and preserving existing content that somehow still in place had to be deleted for whatever reason, maybe because the CEO did contribute a blog post and he doesn't really appreciate that being deleted, or whatever else reason, or there is a legacy community that still has some value. It's overshadowing the entire website because of its volume. These parts of the website can be migrated, right? So what is being done in that instance is you take that content that is sub-ideal because of changed circumstances, and rather than deleting it, you just transition that to a functional domain. That might be a domain that is a .blog or the community or whatever, but it's really critically important to make sure that the branded domains, especially the ones that are with one's own brand for large websites, that these are being actually registered. And it's much more preferable, of course, to have a large portfolio of registered domains that are just 301 redirected and never used, or that are just not being used, period, rather than having to purchase that domain at some point in time from the aftermarket, at which point in time, of course, it is a much more costly endeavor.
So Kaspar, I'd love to spend more time talking. We could talk for ages. I want to try and be mindful of my audience and make sure that they get as much out of this as you're not giving too much to blow their minds. Been phenomenal to have you on as a guest on the show today. Obviously, all of Kaspar's contact details, if you have a manual penalty and you need some help, all of his contact details will be available in the show notes. It only remains, please, if you see Philly, pass on my kindest regards. I absolutely love the pair of you, but you're both great guys. And I look forward to having the opportunity to spend more time in person with you at the next event that you go to. So yeah, so it just remains for me to say thanks again for being a fantastic guest on the podcast today. And hopefully we'll speak to you on the next episode.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to join the show. Really, it's a humbling experience. Very much appreciated. And as you mentioned, we could talk forever. Let's save more topics for the next opportunity, either face-to-face or on the next show. For today, allow me to say thank you very much. It's been a privilege and a joy.
Good. Thanks, Kaspar. Cheers.